and welcome to the Dear Dyslexic podcast series. I'm your host and fellow dyslexic Shay Wissell. Dear Dyslexic is a community and resource space for everyone, but in particular for young people and adults who have dyslexia. How hard do you think it must be for someone with dyslexia to be able to teach? Well, our guest speaker today has been able to do that and many other things, including writing a book that supports students with dyslexia. She has been a teacher for over 20 years and specialised in dyslexia when she moved over to the UK. I'd like to give a really warm welcome to a huge mentor of mine and also a fellow dyslexic, Sandra Hargreaves. Welcome, Sandra.
Thanks very much.
So, Sandra, Dear Dyslexic is about raising awareness of the successes and challenges of having dyslexia. You have written a wonderful blog for us called The Revelation of a Dyslexic. Can you tell us a bit about your journey and how you were diagnosed with dyslexia?
Well, I didn't know I was dyslexic till I went to live in the UK, and by that stage I was 50. So I had lived in Australia for all those years, and I had trained secondary English teachers. I'd been an English teacher, and I'd also worked in technical and further education. And when I did my first training course in the UK, and I was studying and reading the research about dyslexia, I knew that I had it. And it was like a revelation, and that's what I've called the blog I've put onto your website, and that's how I feel. Because it was just wonderful to know what was wrong with me in terms of the fact that I had issues that I'd had to cope with all my life, and most of which I had covered up. The most important one was my very poor spelling, which has caused me grief all my life. But it didn't stop me from getting on. And teachers made a big deal about it, and people said I was lazy. People never said I was stupid or thick, thank goodness. I know they do use those epithets. But fortunately for me, I got into a selective high school where the girls all laughed at my spelling, and I was constantly having 5 marks taken off every one of my papers, because that's what they did in that school, up to 5 marks for your spelling, half a mark off for every mistake, and my papers came back covered in red ink and spelling mistakes.
That's terrible, isn't it? How disheartening.
Yeah, it was pretty grim, and it makes you tough, because you've got to have a sort of a kernel around you like a tortoise or a turtle, and you have to keep going forward. And I learned to spell, but I didn't realise why I had the problem until I was in the UK and I was 50 years old.
So when you were diagnosed, you were happy to know what was the cause of all your issues. Were there other feelings as well? I know when I was diagnosed, I was happy to find out what was wrong, but I also was really frustrated that I'd been let down through so many school systems and education systems.
Well, I guess that I knew that dyslexia was actually way behind in Australia, and I was just actually very fortunate. We went to the UK at the time, and I was attracted to the area. And the reason I tried to get a job in teacher education in secondary English, as I'd had in Australia. I've been working at Macquarie Uni. But when I went to the UK, they accepted all my qualifications, but they said I didn't have qualified teacher status. So I would have had to have gone back into schools and been re-inspected. And I just knew that was ridiculous. I'd been training teachers, and I just wasn't going to go there. So I applied for a job in the Inner London Probation Service in adult literacy, because I'd worked in adult literacy in technical and further education when my children were small. And they were the people who sent me off to do the dyslexia training. And the whole thing was I just felt I was meant to be there. I was meant to find out I was dyslexic, and then I've been meant to work with dyslexic students for the last 20 years. So I just actually thought it was all very positive. I didn't ever feel negative, because I knew they didn't know at the time that I was being educated what was wrong with me. But the thing is, I am so grateful to the educational psychologist who made sure that I got into the selective high school. And she actually had me moved into the top class in my first year. But, of course, with all the spelling errors and the taking of 5 marks off every paper, I soon went down from that class. But, I survived. And the thing is, when we had our reunion of my school, 50 years at Newcastle Girls High School, I could say, I said that I would edit the newsletter for what everyone had done in their last 50 years. And in that I said I'd been in everyone's class. And I had been, and I knew most of the girls in the school, in the 4 classes that we had at Newcastle Girls High School. And so I don't regard my life as negative, but I just regard the fact that I have dyslexia in many ways as a positive. It's a problem in that I'm poor at languages. I was poor at languages. And, of course, selective high schools are very big on languages. But I just don't try to learn languages anymore because they don't teach them the way I can learn them. Yeah. And I do other things I want to do, but I know I always have to live in an English-speaking country.
Yes, I've tried to learn a couple of languages and it's never quite worked for me either.
No, that's what we can't do. We can't do phonological processing. Yeah. And therefore, it doesn't matter, what's put into that area. It's always going to be a constant failure, which is why the teaching of phonics is not a good idea to people who are dyslexic.
So when you were training as a teacher, did you find it difficult when you were studying?
I had to pass a spelling test, very like the basic skills tests that are now conducted in the UK and probably here too. And I was absolutely terrified that I'd fail. And I knew people who had failed. When I was doing practice teaching, I'd met people who'd failed that spelling test, and they didn't ever go forward. They couldn't go up the graduate assistant scale. They stayed on the bottom row of the scale for the rest of their teaching career until they passed the spelling test. So, I was very alarmed about this, but I learnt spelling. I learnt all of the demons. I knew all of the word families. I had them all typed up, ANTs and ENTs. And that's why, of course, I put those spelling lists into the book which I have written, Study Skills for Dyslexic Students. And those lists of spelling families are there. And I think that whatever works for you to help you is what you should do, and tutors should find out what helps you rather than having a one-size-fits-all program for students. Every student needs to be taught at their point of need.
Which is a real challenge in today's society when it is really one size fits all for everybody. Yes. I think Australia's slowly moving away from that, but we've still got a long way to go, that's for sure. So how did you keep going? Did you find that it was frustrating and you needed a lot of support, or did you just keep at it on your own?
There was no support. I passed the spelling test. I think I got it all right. But, I just spent such a long time getting organised. And the thing is, too, that I missed the first 2 spelling tests at the Teachers' College, just the way things were. I'd gone up to the beach to run over my spelling for the second one, and I pulled out from the curb when I realised what time it was, and a taxi hit me. And I missed in my sister's car. So I missed that appointment. And, of course, timekeeping is another problem with people who are dyslexic. You think you've got more time than you've got. Yes. And so I had to ring up and say I couldn't attend the spelling test. And then when I did it, I was with the people who'd failed, all the people who'd failed the other 2 tests, but I hadn't sat for it. But I managed. And, of course, I was doing an English, I had an English degree, and I was training to be an English teacher. And I got distinctions in my practice teaching, so it was so important that I get through this test, which I did. But when I try to help people in the UK who have to sit for the basic skills tests, I'm very aware of their problems, and they have to do it on the computer, and they can't give them the extra time. Like, they get the answer, but then it's flashed off the screen when they can do it. Yeah. So we have to ask for it to be in a hard copy for them with the extra time, so they can see it and then answer when their processing speed allows them to do that and not fail. Because it doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means they need to have reasonable adjustments put in for them so that they can perform the task asked of them.
So you're majored in English. Do you find that? Did you find it difficult seeing you were dyslexic? So as an English teacher, have you found it areas challenging for you to then be able to teach?
No, I didn't, because I've always been an avid reader, and I learned to read by reading, certainly not by phonic instruction. And so I have a great reservoir of words in my long-term memory, which I know by sight. And I use dictionaries to look up words I used to. Now I use the internet. I was very good at covering always. And so I never put up anything on the board that I couldn't spell. I didn't know how to spell. Mm-hmm. I can remember once, well into I've been teaching for years. I've been working in the teacher education program at Macquarie, and I was training adult literacy officers when my children were small at TAFE. And I was going through the training process because these people were all professional people who'd mostly retired and wanted to do some voluntary work. And they took illiterate adults and they were one-to-one with them because the students had obviously failed so many times they didn't want to come back into an educational institution, but they would work with a tutor. But these people were volunteers. Mm. And I know now, like all these years later, that a lot of those people would have been dyslexic. Yeah. But, of course, it wasn't even spoken about in Australia at the time. So they felt like constant failures. Anyway, I was just talking about how people learn to speak. And I said to the group, well, how do babies learn to speak? And someone said to me, they imitate. And because I was making notes on the board, and I thought, has it got 1 or 2 M's? And I would not write it up. So I wrote repetition on the board, because I know that word very well. And when we had the coffee break, I went out to look it up, and it's got 1 M. But it could have had 2. And so I wouldn't write it on the board. So, I mean, that's how I always covered myself, that if I didn't know how to spell it, I'd put something else up, a synonym, or, I mean, sometimes I'd just sort of say to the kids, who can spell this? You know, in the classroom you can do that because you can make it a game. But you can't do that when you're working with adults. You've really got to say straight out you can't do it or do something else. Another great thing about being dyslexic and knowing is you can tell people.
Yes.
You know, I'm very happy to tell people now.
Me too. I find it definitely hard in the workplace, and I've had to pick my moments around disclosing that I'm dyslexic. And I find once I've done it, I feel so relieved because then I can, if I have trouble, I can say, I can't spell that. Can you help me out? And I don't feel stupid. But it's that initial disclosing that's always a bit anxiety provoking. So do you always, when you go into a workplace now and you're lecturing, do you always say up front, this is a challenge of mine, or?
Oh, yes, I do now that I'm working in dyslexia and have since I've been working in dyslexia. But I didn't, of course, before I knew, and when I was working in Australia, I was always covering my spelling problems. But it's a great liberation, really, and it's wonderful to be able to say, well, this is my problem, was my problem, and I've overcome it, and I've managed to do all these other things in my life.
Yes.
And, you know, I think that's what's good about it, knowing and moving forward.
So you transitioned from teaching in secondary school then through, now you're a senior lecturer training dyslexic tutors and assessors to work in higher education. What does that mean? Because we don't really have them in Australia. Well,
I mean, I've done that work at Macquarie Uni by training English teachers before I went to the UK. Mm-hmm. And then when I went to the UK, I did the dyslexia course and I got a job in the Inland and Probation Service, and they paid for the course. And then I realised I was dyslexic. I was assessed. And then I became a dyslexia coordinator at Uxbridge College, which is like an FE college. And from there I went to Thames Valley University and then to London Metropolitan University. And I went there because of the fact that they were teaching the course to train tutors. And I thought, well, finally I've got myself back into the same level of job. And I really like training tutors and teachers. I find that a very satisfying job because you see people who are enthusiastic going out and doing that work and you can help them. And so it was good. But I didn't feel any problem about moving into training because I've done it before and I enjoy it.
Yeah.
In fact, I prefer to work with adults. I really enjoy working with adults.
So in the workplace, have there been any strategies that you've put in place to help you day to day?
Well, I think you've got to be very organised, and I think a lot of those strategies are in the book Study Skills for Dyslexic Students. But the IT now is very helpful, and you can set up IT diaries on your phone and on your tablet and in your computer, and if you have reminders all the time for things. I also keep a hard copy diary, and I find this really interesting because my husband writes everything into our Apple. We've got an iCloud, and therefore all of the appointments we can see in our phones that the other person's doing, and he sees what I'm doing. But I still write it a hard copy on a calendar, which I have on the wall, and I can see the month ahead of me, and I can see the week ahead of me, and that's how I remember it in my head. Yeah. So I actually find just putting your finger on the day and seeing a dot, on the phone, not very helpful at all, really. I think it's good to be there, but I think everyone has to find their organisation for themselves and to stick to it. Mm. And I think keeping to-do lists is also really useful. They're also in the book. And I've got a very good friend who was the principal of a high school, and she used to keep to-do lists. She was not dyslexic at all, but anything that works for you and that will make sure that you've done everything you intend to do for the day or the week, to keep your appointments, to make sure that you've done your preparation is important, whatever works.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't live without Google Calendars now. It helps
exactly.
me stay organised, that's for sure, so I don't miss anything. And the addresses in there are brilliant because then I don't get lost. So I get there early and I make sure I'm not lost or late with things.
I was just going to say, a great advantage now is Google Maps, because I find when I go to an appointment, when I'm in London, for example, and I go to see somebody or I'm going to see a client, I put on that Google map, and if I'm walking, it shows me if I'm going the right or the wrong way. Mm. And, of course, the other thing is using the phone to drive too. That helps enormously, where if you're going to someplace you don't know, you can follow the directions. And I think all of these IT apps have just made everyone's life, and including dyslexic people, it's much easier. And, of course, we have 3 pieces of software that are given to people in the UK who are dyslexic, and one is a readback program, which they can get on their computer, which highlights the words and reads to them at the same time, so they're seeing and hearing the words at the same time. One is a mind mapping program, which is so helpful for essay planning and organisation in the workplace, and the other one is the speech program, where you can have dictation, which then is typed up. And, of course, anyone with an Apple computer or iPad or iPhone now has that available as well on their device. Yeah,
I couldn't live without speech to text. Mm. Is that the right way around?
Mm-hmm. That's it.
That's it, yes. I use it at work all the time. It's a great tool, and now it's on Word, so you don't even have to buy it.
Yes. A lot of those things are now are freely available, which is wonderful. It means everyone can use them.
That's right. It's so easy to use on Word. I mean, there's a couple of little glitches, but overall it's a great tool, and so technology has been amazing.
It has been, and I can remember when I was working at Macquarie University in the 90s and 80s, and I'd go to see students teach out all over Sydney. I used to write the instructions down, like word for word. I'd look at the map and get my husband to help me, and I had them on my lap, written out in front of me. So, when I was going out to the western suburbs, a long way out, I was driving 20, 30, 40 miles to see someone teaching. And I'd say, turn left, stop at the lights, turn right. And I followed that, religiously. But now I can just look at it, on the iPhone in front of me and follow it. Yeah. And also hear the voice, which is also a big help.
Yeah, hearing the voice for me is a huge help. So I don't get lost. The only time now is if I can't spell the word, but again, Google helps a lot with that now as well. So we're very lucky, really, to be living in these times of technology.
My word.
So you've mentioned about your book, Study Skills for Students with Dyslexia, Helping for Specific Learning Differences, and we have it up on our website. And once we launch your blog, we'll also put the spelling strategies up, which I thought were fantastic, and I wish I'd known about those when I was back in school. Can you tell us a little bit about how the book came about?
Well, the book came about because I was training dyslexia tutors who were all so fantastic that I just felt they'd done such brilliant work that we should sort of collect it and collate it.
Well, it's a fabulous resource, and again, it's on the website for people to link through to be able to purchase it and to have a look. So thank you, because I found it really useful having a look at that and just using some of those strategies even at work. So thanks for putting that together. But you have achieved a lot while you've been in the UK. Not only have you written the book, you've also established the Association of Dyslexic Specialists in Higher Education.
Well, I was part of that. I was part of the initial group, and there were only about 20 people to start off with who were in the beginning, the inception of that organisation. And one of the reasons I suggested it is because we were all just so isolated. One person in each university trying to set up support for dyslexic students, and having that support network again was just wonderful. And now, I mean, the numbers are they'd be into the thousands now, and they're all over the country, and they have regional groups. They have a national conference once a year. They have networking days. It's a really good organisation, and they have a JISC mail service, which is terrific because people can write in on the JISC mail and ask for advice, and other people respond.
So how do you think it's helped support students?
Well, I think it helps to support students enormously because when people have a problem that they can't cope with, they put out a message on the JISC mail, so they are getting the support themselves, and then they're passing that on to the student. Also, you often see a request there for a tutor or an assessor in an area where someone knows the student needs help, and therefore it's across the country, and people can then get in touch and they can tutor or assess the student accordingly. So it's been immeasurable, really, in its assistance. It's a really fantastic organisation.
Can you just talk a little bit about the difference between your tutors and assessors? Because over here, normally you'd need to be assessed by a neuropsychologist or an educational psychologist. Is that the same in the UK? Is that what your assessors go out and do, or...?
Well, we have two forms of assessment in the UK. We have that done by psychologists, and we have that done by dyslexia assessors. And they are people who've got the basic, a postgraduate diploma in dyslexia assessment. So the course that I was running at London Met was a postgraduate certificate to become a tutor, followed by a postgraduate diploma to become an assessor. And it's a very well-structured course because they learn all about tutoring and dyslexia and do all the background theory in the first year to get the certificate. And then they do the assessment tools and do assessments themselves, which have to be assessed in the second year. And then if they wish, they can go on and do an MA in an area of their interest. And then they write a dissertation.
Right. So we've spoken about how Australia is quite far behind, and there aren't any courses like that in Australia yet where you could become a dyslexic assessor. And England's really advanced compared to Australia. So what is it like for people in the UK, do you think? Because you've got your assessors, you've got tutors, people seem to identify...
The UK is a good place to be dyslexic. I think that's really true. There's a lot of support there, especially in higher education. It goes through the schools though, and the other thing is that people have to do a course in their PGCE, which is like the dip ed here, in dyslexia. They know about dyslexia. They're taught about dyslexia when they're trained to be teachers.
Right. Because
I gave sessions to those people when I was working at London Met. They'd asked me to come in and do a session for the PGCE, and I did. So they have that awareness, and of course it's not the mystery that it still is, and it's not negated, as I still find it is here, where people say, there's no such thing as dyslexia. They're not saying that in the UK, fortunately. And it's addressed, and people feel they can say they've got it without feeling they're going to be discriminated against. The thing is that the workplace is always the most difficult place, and some people who've had support at university are dubious about whether they should tell their employer.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that if they don't, they will not get the support.
Mm.
And, we always advise that they will, because there's a group called Access to Work, which provides support for dyslexic people in the workplace, and those with other SpLDs. And Access to Work gives you one-to-one tutorial support and IT support up to a certain number of hours to provide you with the help you need to do your job. And again, there are software programs that are given, but as you're saying, a lot of these things now are freely available. But just to have a proper workplace assessment after you've had a dyslexia assessment, and for the assessor to go into the workplace with you and look at your workplace and make suggestions to your employer. I could give you a couple of examples of people I've worked with. I was helping a young woman who, she'd been on maternity leave, and they were trying to get rid of her. They wanted to get rid of her because she wanted to try and work at home some of the time, and she was very dyslexic. She had the assessment done. And when I went out to see her at work, she was working for a gigantic company where they all hot desked, so she was never on the same computer. There was a gigantic screen in front of the hot desks which played Parliament, not with the sound but with the visual display of Parliament on that screen all day when Parliament was running. You had to book a room to work independently. You had to go and book a room if you wanted to work on your own. And when I looked at this, I just couldn't think of anything worse for anyone who was dyslexic to work in. If you tried, you couldn't have conjured up a worse picture. So I wrote a report and said that they would be well advised to let her work at home a couple of days a week, because she would have the ability to think without all these screens and not knowing what computer she was logged into and where she was, and to make the booking of these private rooms more accessible and less discriminatory. Like she said that people said you were hopeless if you had to go and book one of those rooms and you couldn't work on the floor. So it's a matter of someone assessing the situation. And another woman that I had at university who went to work for the BBC, she was fantastically proactive. And when she'd been at university at London Met, she told all the lecturers she was dyslexic. She had people read her papers to her. She had an amanuensis who wrote the answers for her. And she got an award of merit from the university at her graduation, and I went. It was wonderful to see that. And then when she got the job in the BBC, she was again on an open floor, and she had an accountancy degree. And so she set up with the person who was helping her ways of coping. So she had a little hat on her computer, which when she had it in a certain place on the computer, it said, do not disturb me, don't interrupt me. So she could concentrate. And then when she wanted to speak to people, she would take the hat off this corner of the computer, and people knew they could come up and talk to her without disturbing a train of thought. And so she had, lots of things in place, but she was very proactive and always told people and always had a foot in the door. And that's how she survived.
I guess that's one of the problems in Australia, because there's no support at the moment for people in the workplace. It's really hard to disclose, because if you do disclose, I've found that people actually they don't know. They say, "Well, what do you need?" They don't know what you need. They don't understand what it means. And so unless you're really proactive, like that girl, it's really hard because there's no one to tell them what you need. And so it's real catch-22. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't disclose in Australia, because there isn't that support, which we're hoping to change in the future. But there's some really good examples of why it's so important to be able to have assessors come in and support people.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, in the UK, there's a law that encourages people to employ people who are disabled. Now, I don't know whether you've got that here, but so many percent of people should be disabled in a workplace. So you'll often see people, for example, in wheelchairs or whatever, working. And therefore, a lot of people, because dyslexia is regarded as a disability in the UK, and is under the Disability Act, they're quite happy to take people in who are dyslexic, because that also makes up their quota of people who are disabled in big organisations.
Right.
And they can say that to the government, when they're audited. And so those sort of things help. And of course, some people who've got disabilities make very good employees for a variety of reasons, because they have understanding and sympathy and empathy for other people who have them as well. So to me, it's only positive to employ people and to put the strategies in and the reasonable adjustments so they can function at their peak.
That's right, because I think for people with dyslexia, the reasonable adjustments are not expensive, and they're really simple things like, letting a person have their own desk, or letting them download the software to put on their computer. So they're not expensive, and the outcomes are huge for the organisation.
Yeah. And the other thing is that they have strengths that other people don't have. Like, they have often very good long-term memories, and they're lateral thinkers. And those sorts of skills are very useful in organisations, so that when you're in a meeting, often someone who's dyslexic can come at something from a different point of view, and they are often extremely helpful in problem solving.
Over the next 5 years, the UK is doing really well, but what do you think could change both in Australia and the UK, because you share your time across both countries, that could improve outcomes for people with dyslexia?
Well, I wouldn't want you to think that it's all roses in the UK, because unfortunately the Conservative government is cutting funding, which they do. So it isn't that easy, but it's certainly better than Australia from what I can perceive. Of course, what I'd like to see happen here is that people could be assessed easily, that they could have support, that they would get support in the universities and in the colleges, in the schools and in the workplace, and that being dyslexic was not a sort of burden, that it was just something that made you different, and that you could be supported in achieving the best you can do in your area. That's what I'd like to see.
Yeah. And are there any top tips that you could give for students in the at uni or TAFE and in the workplace? I know you've written a book, so it might be hard to narrow down what the top tips might be.
Well, I think that there are a few things. I think the most important thing is to never, ever give up, ever. I also think that if you think you're in the wrong course, and I've advised people about this, don't be afraid to change. I remember tutoring a boy that just so upset me, one boy at university who came to me who'd been doing the same course at another university, and his parents had very high expectations about him, and he'd failed, and he'd come in, and I was tutoring him. I was his dyslexia tutor. And I said to him after about a month, I said, look, you're on the wrong course. I said, you know that, and I know that. And I said, all you can really do is change your course. And this great look of relief came over his face. Because I think it's really important to know that it's not failure to make a change, to realise that the first decision you made is not necessarily the best, and to change courses. And I have done that in my life. And I think that the other thing is that you really need to know how you think and learn. And if you can have that metacognition of how you think and learn, it makes such a difference to your life. Like, if I'd known I was an auditory learner long ago, which I know now, I wouldn't have tried twice or three times to do a correspondence course and just hated it. When all these notes came through the post and I had to sit there, and this was before computers, and I know things are much better now because there are podcasts for courses that are on distance learning, and there are chat rooms, but I need to go into a class and listen to what someone has to say, and listen to the other students and hear their opinions, and that's how I learn. And so they would be my top tips, that you're not a failure if you change. You're just saying, that's not for me, this is a better choice.
Well, thank you so much, Sandra, for coming on the show today and for sharing your story. And I think it's really important for people to hear what's happening in the UK and how we can bring that across to Australia to support students in higher education and in the workplace.
Thanks very much, Shay. And look, all the very best. And I'm only too happy to try and help with whatever I can do to move things forward and get a better lot for dyslexic people in Australia.
Thank you so much. And for those that want to find out more about Sandra's story, you can go on to the Dear Dyslexic website. You can also find information on her book there, and her blog will be out soon. So thank you for listening. Until then, bye for now.